for.
All right. Well, it feels like we've all come in, and most of us have sat down. Given the technology, you people have to stay very quiet until it's your turn to talk, because every breath in and out can be heard on the microphones at the moment. My name's Dan Smith. I'm director of CIPRI, and it's really my pleasure to welcome you all here. And thank you so much for coming despite the gorgeous weather. We really are pleased to see you. Sitting with me are 4 members of the board of Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, and I will introduce them in a moment. We would normally have had another 2 or 3 members of the board, and there was one more on the invitation to you all. Unfortunately, she had a medical issue which precluded her from flying on doctor's orders, so she's stayed in the US, Jessica Matthews. But together with us to discuss Untangling the World's Crises, which is obviously, a small task to take on. We'll take them on one at a time, spend 5 or 10 minutes on each one, and get out in time to enjoy the good weather. And to help us doing that, when I sit down, sitting next to where I'm sitting, will be Patricia Lewis, who is the Research Director for International Security at Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London, and was before Director of UNIDIR, the UN Disarmament Research Institute, and before that doing various other things such as VERTIC, the Verification Technology Information Center on arms control issues. Sitting next to Patricia is Stefan Löfven, who of course you know is former Prime Minister, former leader of the Social Democratic Party, and chairman of the board of CIPRI. Sitting next to Stefan is Radha Kumar, who is an Indian activist and author, and amongst other things, you were chair of the UN University Council, and also founder director of the Delhi Policy Group. And at the far end, Mohammed Ibn Chambas, who has an astonishingly rich diplomatic and political career. Amongst other things, has been president of ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, has also been the special representative of the Secretary General in West Africa, and is now the African Union Special Representative on silencing the guns. So, having introduced everybody, I'm going to sit down and explain how we're going to do this. And every time we have the board come to Stockholm, we want to help the understanding of issues, help the understanding of problems by drawing on the board's knowledge and wisdom. It is a multinational group with a lot of experience. Each one has a lot of experience behind them. And this is a time with the crises that we face when we need a good discussion, an intense discussion, and a widespread discussion of the problems. And I'm going to be asking you all to join in to this discussion as much as possible. And here's how we're going to do it. I think of security as being the space in which 3 problems overlap, as in the circles of a Venn diagram. One is the question, what some people call hard security or traditional security, the national security questions. The second one, introduced more recently, maybe some 30 years ago in the UN Human Development Report, the idea of human security. And more recently, as we have begun to realize, as the crisis presses down upon us, the idea of ecological security. And within each of these security realms, there is something going on or many things going on that we could refer to as crises. So in the ecological security realm, for example, climate change, but also pollution. And under the heading of pollution, air pollution, chemical pollution, plastics pollution, soil overload, soil depletion, ocean acidification, and so on. And biodiversity loss, loss of biomass, as well as biodiversity, and so on. several crises to choose under that heading of ecological crisis. And under the heading of national security, also many. I mean, a lot of energy, care and concern and worry and activity is being focused on Ukraine at the moment and on Russia's war of aggression in Ukraine. But in 2022, there were 55 other countries where there was open armed conflict going on. And Ukraine, as horrible as it is not yet the most lethal of contemporary conflicts. That's probably Ethiopia. We're also worrying about what's happening in Sudan. Violence in Palestine is greater than it has been since the end of the last Intifada. Where else do we not worry about? And then aside from the armed conflicts themselves, one can think about the crisis of arms control, basically has come to an end, or you can think about confrontation over Taiwan between China and the US. In general, the poison in the toxin in geopolitics. And under the heading of human security, one could be thinking about food insecurity, rising tide of food insecurity through the last 8 years. Until about 2015, the situation with world hunger was improving. Since then, it's been declining, and then catastrophically declining during the pandemic, and with a second step of decline because of the effects of the Ukraine war and the sanctions. Cost of living crisis that's connected to that. Health crises all around, the pandemic, but not only that. Rising worries about crime in many different headings. So what I'm going to ask each of the board members to do is to pick their favorite crisis. Patricia's going to go first. I think the only reason why you're going first, Patricia, is I have actually known you longer than I have known any of the others. So that, regard that as a privilege of friendship. A few minutes, 5 minutes maybe.
We were children, right?
When we were children, yes. But 5 minutes maybe to, I'm not going to be tight on the time, but not a long speech. Outline the main dimensions of your favorite crisis and some thoughts about whether and how it's possible to intervene, to make steps towards managing, resolving, easing that crisis, moving on to a better future. I'll then ask each of the other three board members to comment on that, and then throw it open for a few minutes for discussion involving you. If you have questions, thoughts. The only question which you won't be allowed to ask is, why did you pick that crisis? Or why didn't you pick my favorite crisis? Everybody has a favorite crisis, but leave that to one side for a moment. Then when we've chatted through for a bit on Patricia's crisis, then we'll go on to Stefan's crisis, and so on along the board. And so I hope that there will be, some optimism coming out of this. I hope there will be some clarity. I hope we will be seeing crises in relation to each other. I've not used this format before. I invented it this afternoon because somebody asked me a question of, Dan, what on earth are we going to do in Finlandshuset this evening? And I had to come up with an answer, so I came up with this one. So, Patricia, your favorite crisis and your 5 minutes.
Thank you, Dan. So I am what our dear, glorious former leader, Boris Johnson, likes to call a girly swot, which basically means a smart woman who knows things. And I, as a result, prepared 3 potential crises. So I'm choosing one now, but I have others in my pocket, should you wish to call on me again, in case my colleagues don't do everything you want. So I'm going to go with what I think is the most important crisis that we're facing at the moment, and it won't surprise you to hear it's Russia's invasion of Ukraine last year. And I've spoken about this before in many cases, and I'll tell you why I think it's I won't say favorite, it's my least favorite crisis, actually. And it's because that this is a founding member of the United Nations, one of the great powers, one of those that really helped win World War II, that has trounced over international law, has trounced over any form of responsible behavior as a member of permanent member of the Security Council and a depository state for the Non-Proliferation Treaty, a nuclear weapons holder. And And it did so in 2014 when it invaded Crimea. And it believed that the muted, shall we say to be polite, reaction from countries other than Ukraine was a sign that they had greater power than they clearly have, and a sign that they could do more at a later date. And what we're seeing now is Ukrainian resistance. I think that is the only way to think about it, in the classic form of resistance. We're not seeing a war between Russia and Ukraine. We're seeing an invasion by Russia into Ukraine, and Ukraine resisting that invasion. And I think it's really important that we characterize it in that way. And I think this crisis is adding to our understanding of conflict, because I always like to put a positive learning spin on things. And I hope will add to our understanding of conflict prevention, which is where CIPRI needs to be, Chatham House needs to be, where we all need to think for the future. You mentioned your Venn diagram, and I will add on to that Venn diagram, because within each of those intersecting circles is a complex system, which also intersect with each other, full of nodes, full of points of departures, and all sorts of potential pathways to a wide range of outcomes. Very complex, intersecting complex set of systems in a hostile environment, right? And those systems intersect with each other, but they also intersect and interrelate with their environment. So we have several complex systems, several crises embedded within our environment, and they are all connecting with each other. So it's not surprising that the crisis in Ukraine that caused by Russia is causing problems for energy security, food security, the climate, etc., because they are all, as you say, connected to human security. They're all part of that same system. And it's one small act in one can lead to a much larger outcome in the other, as we have seen so far, and we are likely to see again. So what we can do, I think, is never let a crisis go to waste. And we can start to understand this complex system, or these set of complex systems, and the way they intersect in their hostile environment, to understand complexity better in our world, and understand the range of outcomes. And we can actually start to model this. And we've been doing a model of the complex system of nuclear policy decision-making, and trying to understand the ways in which policy decisions are made and what the outcomes might be, the unintended consequences, if you like, of those things. And then help, maybe through game playing, maybe through scenario work, decision makers understand that complexity. Because too often we tend to think in a very kind of step-by-step way. And, you know, if I do this, then that will happen. And it doesn't. If you do X, then a whole range of things, not just X happens, then Y and Z, it's a whole range of things can happen. And it's very hard to predict. But what we can predict is a wide range of outcomes, and actually see the range of those outcomes and how we might prevent the worst of them, at least have a go at preventing the worst of them, by understanding the pathways that lead to them. So one of the things that I think we're seeing right now is what we might call the crisis of prevention, the not having put in place things that we know work in terms of prevention. And this is a very difficult discussion to have at the moment, because we're in a crisis. But we all know that there are things that could have been done that could have prevented this situation. Talking about them doesn't mean that we're blaming anyone. That's really important. The one to blame is the one carrying out the action. There's no doubt about that. Let's get that clear. But we might have prevented it by doing other things to head them off at the pass, for example. So we need to really understand the set of things that we might have done to reduce the likelihood of this outcome, prevent the worst excesses of what's happening now, for example, and start to put some of those in place around the world. Stress test them, use games to think through in terms of decision making. And then I would leave you with this thought, because it leads on to my crisis number 2. But this has led, I think, to a crisis in nuclear weapons policy. And we're in a situation now where for those who didn't like nuclear weapons, like them even less, and those who liked nuclear weapons like them even more. So we've not made any headway there. But I think what we have got is a situation now where we can see that if we don't address the issue of nuclear weapons, we can no longer put aside the idea that they're just for the background, they're just political weapons, that now we have the overt threat of use. And that should lead us to a deeper examination of where nuclear weapons, the role that they have. And what we're seeing, I think, is a big distinction between democratic states that put human rights at the center of their policy making, human security states, which are not perfect, but that's where they're heading. And these are states that have adopted the Landmines Convention, the Cluster Munitions Convention, the Chemical Weapons Convention, Biological Weapons Convention, and so on. We're seeing them, quite rightly, have a deep reluctance to use nuclear weapons, what Ben Wallace, the Secretary of Defense in the UK, calls reinforcing the nuclear use taboo. And he used that phrase at Munich. Very important moment. Versus, I think, states that are more authoritarian, that might, well, and we're seeing with Putin, want to use weapons to coerce, to compel, to bully, or they imagine that if they threaten to use nuclear weapons, that we'll all, in our panic, keel over and give them what they want. And I think Putin imagined that people would be on the streets of Stockholm and London marching against the idea that there might be nuclear war. And what we've seen is not that, which is very interesting. But what we don't want to do is in any way reinforce the idea that some potential despots might have, is that if they get nuclear weapons, that they will benefit from that. So that's where I'm going to leave it, and I hope that helps.
Oh, thanks very much, Patricia. I mean, it's quite a challenge to take on, and you know, summarizing the main dimensions of a crisis and something to do about it. And you decided to go for 2 crises, so, you know.
Yeah, I kind of merged, but I've still got more to say on the nuclear weapons one.
So, Stefan, what I'm looking for now is some comments from other board members on the crisis that Patricia has put on the table and thoughts about it. So, Stefan first.
Yes, thank you. First, it is, of course, very relevant, and given also CIPRI's vision of being able to identify and understand potential conflicts in order to prevent them, I think we also believe that we need to, what can we learn from this? And right now, I think the most important thing is also for peace lovers to make sure that Russia does not win this war, and that Ukraine is still an independent nation after this. So right now, the soil, the conditions for peace is not that good. But the other alternative, Russia winning this war, would be even worse. So I think that is right now focus. But and then the difficult question arrives: what happens after? There will be peace at some time, and Russia is where Russia is. It will not move. We are where we are. We're not going to move either. Our country's borders are where they are. So we have to find a way of living together, and that, of course, depends a lot on what path Russia chooses. But I know also there are people, and just to be sure, to avoid misunderstanding, there's no excuse whatsoever for what Putin has done. But all the years before, from the German reunification and until now, was there things, signs that we could have seen, that we could have learned from, that perhaps there is tensions being built up here now? Putin's problem is that he has at least 3 motivations for his acting. He wants an empire, he wants to become Tsar, he wants to denazify Ukraine, which is, I mean, yeah. But the third is that Russia feels the threat from a NATO coming closer and closer to Moscow. And once again, it doesn't excuse them for doing what they're doing. But I read once that Robert Kennedy quoted his brother, John F. Kennedy, saying that after the missile crisis in Cuba in 1962, the main lesson, the core lesson for President Kennedy was that you have to be able to stand in the other nation's shoes. Now, even if we don't excuse their acts now, after when we come into a process to build peace, nations have to be able to stand in other nations' shoes to understand what are their conditions, prerequisites for building for building a peace. Thank you.
Stefan, thank you. And Rada.
I want to take up your point about prevention, Patricia. You know, one of the most agonizing aspects of conflict resolution or peacemaking is the problem that despite endless feasible proposals for prevention, it has simply never worked. We thought we had advanced quite a lot when we managed to get early warning systems adopted, but to get the political will to act on the signals is a whole other set of issues and problems. And of course, very few countries will step up to prevent a crisis. They might step up when the crisis is so advanced that they can't ignore it anymore, or if it's an ally, or for that matter, an enemy. But other than that, the idea that you can actually, that prevention actually involves less, a lower scale of action, less cost, less investment. That idea, how do you make policy circles grasp that idea? And of course, for a democracy, there's the added problem that elections are every 5 years, so your actions are also 5-year cycles. How do you manage to get the idea that no matter what change of government you have, prevention is a good in itself that requires continuity of action? And your example of Ukraine is, of course, one of the most telling examples ever, because right from the end of the Cold War, people were talking about how to somehow give the Russian policy establishment a sense of confidence, how to prevent them from going down the path of insecurity, paranoia, etc. 2014, then you had Crimea. So you had, goodness knows, impossible to ignore signals of building up to a certain point, and yet with all the primacy and importance that Russia had, certainly for Europe and for the US as well, even so you couldn't get to that point of thinking of what types of action can be preventive. And that has always, been a source of great reflection. So what do you do? How do you get to that point of getting countries to prevent? Oops.
Thank you, Rada. And Mohammed.
I was trying to scribble down here a question triggered perhaps by the so-called peace mission by 6 African heads of state, which has been in the media, apparently prepared by a French foundation, Fondation Brazzaville, and the countries are significant countries in Africa: South Africa, Egypt, Senegal, Congo-Brazzaville, Zambia, and the 6th one escapes me, So the question would be, is it reasonable that these African heads of states will be seeking a peaceful resolution of the Ukraine crisis? Because when there are crises in Africa, and there are some major ones on scale bigger than Ukraine, as you just mentioned, for instance, with what we unfortunately witnessed in Ethiopia, the recommendation is always, no, seek peaceful, mediated settlements. Throwing more arms and weapons into the crisis is not the answer. It will only worsen, and particularly when you see that it's getting to a point where superpowers are about to get into direct confrontation. And also the consequences already being felt by many African countries. Diplomatically, the pressure on them is unbearable to choose sides. And they're saying, wait a minute, we don't want to be drawn into it. Or secondly, with disruptions of grains, as we saw to countries such as Egypt, Sudan, and others, and fertilizers as a result of sanctions. So is it unreasonable that they are groping to say, look, somehow find a way to resolve it other than we'll throw more billions into this conflict?
Thank you, Mohammed. Patricia, is there anything you want to pick up quickly before I ask audience for any thoughts?
Well, so I think Stefan and Raja asked two sides of the same coin question. So what I would say is that there are lots of things I think, I'll put that down. There are lots of things I think that we know about prevention. And what we're not doing is really, as you say, Raja, I think, making sure we understand how to make that happen. And one of the things that I think we could do is take prevention of conflict as seriously as we take prevention of disease. And in fact, conflict is a disease, right? So if we were to invest in prevention the same way as medical researchers invest in prevention, and understand that, what is equivalent to a healthy diet, what is equivalent to vaccination, what is equivalent to medication, etc., exercise, all the things that we all love doing, right? But, if we could do that and take it with the same degree of seriousness, then I think we'd start to make a dent in it. And then, Mohammed, I think you ask really, really important questions. And what I would say for many states around the world, particularly in unstable environments, is that transgression of the UN Charter. If you decide to ignore what happened to Ukraine, don't be surprised if people ignore when it happens to you. Now, the quid pro quo is that we have often ignored when it's happened to others, and that's a mistake. And one of the problems we've had in a lot of this discussion is the false equivalence, right? So, we've talked often, I think, about the false equivalence of the invasion of Iraq. The equivalence is that they're both wrong, right? And I think, people in our situations can say they were both wrong. So it's in calling out that wrong, we can also say that the invasion of Ukraine was wrong. You're not putting one against the other. And we need to call these things out more when they happen all around the world and not ignore the conflicts that aren't just in our backyard. And I think that's an absolutely correct criticism of this.
Audience, questions or thoughts? Agreeing, disagreeing, asking for more. There's one here. There's a microphone coming to the... There you are. And if you could just say who
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm Frederica Warnbrandt, Director and Acting Head of the Department for UN Policy, Conflict and Migration at the Ministry for Foreign Affairs. Thank you so much for this interaction and the very interesting discussion that we are having here tonight. I mean, before taking on the hat I have right now, I happen to be the migration ambassador as well. I was also counterterrorism coordinator, and of course we discussed prevention a lot and how to avoid terrorist organizations such as Al-Qaeda and Daesh to gain ground, so to speak. And we had this famous UNDP report, I now forget the name of it, but it was quite clear that prevention is key, especially the respect of human rights. But at the same time, we have to admit that somehow we have failed. Because looking at the world today compared to 2015 and when the conflicts were going down and people weren't as hungry as today, etc. So I'm just wondering, what have you learned? Because we can see that we didn't quite succeed in Afghanistan, despite huge resources getting in there. We can look at West Africa and Mali, not that successful. But we can also take Liberia, and maybe Yemen, where we maybe could see some positive developments. So I was just wondering, what do you see from your respective fields in terms of success factors, especially because we've been talking about a whole of government approach, the importance of looking at the local context, involving all stakeholders, etc. But what would you say is the key instruments to address in these various crises that we have? Then just a short comment on sanctions. Sometimes it seems like there is a narrative that sanctions has actually contributed to the kind of worsening of what's going on in the world. However, one have to remember that sanctions are there for a cause. And there are clauses and exemptions to enable humanitarian accessibility, and the banks de-risking, we know a lot about it, and we can inform them about risks, but they are actually the ones doing the de-risking and kind of drawing their own conclusions on who to support and not financially. So I think it's very, very important not getting into the narrative that sanctions contribute to a worsening of the development in the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Is there another question? I think we have time for another. Yes, one over here. And then I'll ask you to respond, Patricia, and then we'll move on to the next round of discussion.
Thank you. My name is Lena Sund. I'm retired from UN and from the foreign ministry. I wanted actually to pick up on what Dr. Chambas said about, because parallel to the crisis that you have been talking about, the aggression against Ukraine, I see also the multilateral and international crisis. And I wanted, you did already comment a little bit about it, but I think it is glaring now how countries outside of Europe do not really see this as a matter between Ukraine and Russia, but rather United States and Russia, or NATO and Russia. And that is why they find it difficult, even though they agree with that, yes, there was an aggression, but, and as you said, I mean, why didn't you do anything about Iraq, or why did you allow Iraq, etc. So my question is really, how can that be fixed? Thank you.
So that's a...
I'm not sure I understood that. How?
Well, I mean, the equivalence argument, or the why do you take a different view on Iraq than you do on Ukraine, or whatever the criticisms of the West are, which come from, as you were saying, from many quarters in the world. I think not from all governments outside of the US and its alliance systems. But, I mean, that is a very widespread question. What I think, I mean, if I were to put this in two parts, and I don't think you have time to answer it now, but one part would be, what is the problem that lies behind that question being asked? What is that question, in a sense, a symptom of? And then how can that be fixed? And having said that you don't have time to answer it, I mean, I'm really serious. You don't have time to answer it.
So is that telling me I won't answer it then?
Yeah.
Okay, can't answer it then.
Did you want to respond at all to Frederica?
I mean, we've not learned a lot. That's my answer. But I mean, I think we do have to understand that view from outside as well, and understand that there is a lot of, I think, justifiable anger of the treatment of other conflicts around the rest of the world. And also, the further you are away from the conflict, quite naturally, the less you think of it as really pertaining to you. That may not be true, but it's easier to feel that way.
Okay, well, moving on. I think I want to pick out two things from what Patricia was saying and from this discussion. One is the sense that we have here a complex series of linkages between different problems. And the second one, really picking up on your question a little, you know, where have we gone wrong, is picking up on the metaphor you used about health. And you said, you know, if we took prevention as seriously as we take public health prevention, then maybe we'd get something done about it. But public health is best assured by a healthy system, strong infrastructure, healthy diets, plenty of exercise. It's how you live. But it's not just how the better off amongst you live, it's how everybody lives, which assures public health. And that's what we don't have. We don't have a healthy system. And that, I think, is at some point where we have to get to in this conversation. But now let's park that thought, and Stefan, not being too flippant about it, but I will continue to use the term, what's your favorite crisis?
Okay. Actually, I've chosen something that I think will pick up your question and that also Patricia's raised, and that is trust and mistrust, lack of trust and huge mistrust. I think that is a crisis. When I was asked to co-chair the high-level advisory board on effective multilateralism, of course I said yes, because there are so many things that we need to solve together with a global perspective, and we're not doing that right now. We're doing it very bad. And I think the Secretary General's call he was rather shouting in our common agenda that now we have this opportunity. It's either it's a breakthrough or breakdown, I think he chose to call it, and he's right. I worked with this for over a period of 1 year, and it is obvious to me, it becomes more and more clear that this mistrust that we have in the world, in different perspectives, we have this huge geopolitical change with combating China and US, who is supposed to be number one on the world arena, and they're trying to attract others to that, forming blocs. So if China and Russia and other countries, whereas US hope that Europe will decouple China and join US, and we have an African continent that is, I think, rightly so, very annoyed, irritated. I think that's one of the reasons why they are questioning this, and they have all the right to be. So you have China, US, we have this path towards blocs, and we have north-south or developing or whatever we like to call ourselves. And perhaps the third one is the most dangerous one. I mean, West and North, we must admit it, we have done so many stupid things over history towards poorer countries in the world, towards South. We have redrawn maps at the African continent and in the Middle East that cause a lot of trouble. We are now annoyed, we are worried that China is investing a lot in Africa, and there is a reason for that, yes. But the question is, why did we not invest earlier? We could have done that if we, instead of exploiting a whole continent. So there is a very, very deep mistrust. And we have to get out of that, because all these crises that climate, health, peace, terrorism, organized crime, all these we need to solve at the global level. We need to cooperate in order to be able to solve them. And of course also work in regions and in countries, but we have to have a global perspective on that. Now we have to get back to that. This issue of borders or the Russian invasion of Ukraine. We have to end up at the global level with the perspective that no, it is not okay to change borders with military violence. That is absolutely not okay, because if we prove that, all countries will be unsafe, including African countries. They will also be unsafe. But in order to build a trust, I think also North developed, or again, whatever we call ourselves, need to show that we have understood, we really understand the problem, the history that we have been there to cause ourselves, actually. We understand that when we will change. One of the things that we need to change is to show that we are serious when it comes to cooperation, North-South. We are serious when it comes to investment. Also because we understand that if we invest in other continents, if we can lift other people from poverty, that is good for them, but it's also good for the global economy. Because if people can actually take part in the economy, they will contribute in the economy. That's why Lula did what they did with Bolsa de Familia in Brazil, and we have seen the effect of hundreds of millions of Chinese lifting from poverty to some kind of middle class. So I think we have to admit to try to build that, to bridge that gap. We must say, we really show that we understand history. We have done a lot of mistakes, but we do understand that we have to take another path because we want to, or rather, we must find a common view on borders, security, and all that. We must find a common view and common action strategy when it comes to climate. We must find it on health issues. And that is where we start. But I think a lot of it lies in the developed world's hands to show we are ready to change now, we understand.
Thank you, Stefan. Rada, what's your response to that, and what are your thoughts?
Well, we Indians love philosophy. And so I have to say I'm deeply moved by your argument on crisis of trust. And I see it as a very serious issue. The problem, though, is that it's very difficult to equalize power imbalances. And, you know, we're all aware of the need for UN reform. We're all aware of the crisis of the Security Council, which first we saw over Iraq, now we see over Ukraine. But where's the space to find that reform? How do we get to a point where we can, even if you get a critical mass in the General Assembly, will that impact on members of the Security Council sufficiently for them to start to consider giving up a few of their privileges? How do you do that?
Mohammed.
No, just to say on the issue of trust, I agree with Stefan that it's standing in the way of many otherwise very brilliant initiatives at UN level and at several levels to improve the workings of the international system. And from the point of view of the South, let me say especially Africa, there is now a lot of focus on all the conditionalities that come demanding the African side to do X, Y, and Z. And on the other hand, there is a growing feeling that there's often too much of a failure of promises on the part of partners. So here we have to go back again to emphasize on mutual accountability. In other words, holding each other's feet to the fire. That when we make undertakings, both sides have responsibility to live up to their undertakings and also to ensuring that there is follow-through. And I think that particularly on the climate talks and the very frequent exchanges going on within the context of COP, etc., there is still an opportunity to work to restore some of this lost trust, to rebuild trust, and to demonstrate that the international community, all of us can work together. There's an existential threat to big and small, even if the shrill voice of the South is saying, but we didn't cause this problem, we didn't cause, or at least we didn't contribute as much to it as possible. But there is recognition now, frankly, even to the smallest communities, that climate change is posing an existential threat. So we're all in it together. Let us work together to address it. And if this mutual accountability can be restored and enforced, I think it will go a long way to repairing the deficit in trust.
And Patricia?
Yeah, I think everything that's been said has been really insightful and helpful. I would say that I would ask for us to reposition the SDGs. They have gone off track, right? The war against Ukraine has sort of diverted that commitment, that promise. And there is accountability within that system, but I think everybody's let it go off the boil. And I would say that to get things back on track, what we really should be focusing on is creating an equal playing field for all peoples, equal opportunities for trade, for health, for education, for access to technology, and protection from criminal activities online, for example. If we could create an equal playing field, just give everyone a fighting chance, it would make a huge difference, wouldn't it?
And audience thoughts. So right in front of you, there's two, and then one there.
Yeah, thank you very much. My name is Peywan Zaite. I'm Chargé d'Affaires of the Iraqi Embassy. Just a quick clarification. I'm not justifying any invasions. Of course, our position is very clear when it comes to international...
Can you just put the mic in?
International principle and international law and respecting the principles anchored in the UN Charter. That's very clear. I think the situation in Iraq was different a little bit. Looking at it not from a top-down perspective, but from a bottom-up perspective. It was actually the will of the Iraqi people. The overwhelming majority of Iraqi people wanted to get rid of the dictatorship and of a totalitarian regime. And that's why I think there was a kind of acceptance, even international acceptance. So that's just, I wanted to clarify that. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm Diane, Ambassador of Rwanda. And my question is there any study or research to measure the efficiency of the UN Security Council? Because when you look at the role and authority of this organ, it ranges from fostering negotiations, imposing sanctions, authorizing use of force and the deployment of UN peace-building missions. But I'm a witness and testimony of some failures of these UN security missions, especially in my country during the genocide against the Tutsi in 1994. So my question is, who is assessing the efficiency of this entity? Because we seem to be driven fully by them, and if they make a mistake, it's, the impact is huge. And how can they learn from some countries, some initiatives, some operations that are successful? Thank you.
There's a couple of people in the audience, actually, who might answer that question quite well in terms of what work there is, what study, what assessments have been done about comparing the efficiency and the actions of the UN Security Council over time. And I'll see if they think they know who I'm referring to and might put their hands up. But first of all, here.
Thank you. Thank you, Dan. Thank you, CIPRI, for organizing this timely event, and thanks for all the speakers today with their very
keep the mic to your
with their very interesting intervention and remarks. My remark goes back to the first to the word crisis. I think the most important thing here is that we should also associate our discussion on word crisis with the international security architecture. All these crises are reminiscent of an ailing international security architecture. And I think I have been following, for example, within the UN, and till now, all the UN efforts and policies towards prevention. But I don't think they could work while we are entangled by really a very, an international architecture that needs to be reformed. So you cannot push forward efforts within the United Nations without seeing this architecture being reformed. And my last observation goes to Mohammed ibn Shambas, whom I have met in New York also. And thanks for your efforts towards the Sahel region also at that time. Ibn Shambas brings a very important remark here that makes me think and probably support all those who are, all those analysts now in the national scene that say that the peace efforts of tomorrow would be more flexible than they are now. What Ibn Shambas is saying that there is like a flexible grouping of heads of states that have come together to look at the conflict in Ukraine. I think this is probably giving us a significant idea of peace efforts in the future that would be probably led within a very small grouping and not, emanating from like robust alliances that we are probably seeing their disappearance, or we will probably see the disappearance of big groupings and alliances that would be replaced in the future by some sort of moves, flexible moves, as Mohammed ibn Shambas has been saying earlier. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Stefan, response to comments from your fellow board members and from the audience.
I will start from, I haven't done so much research on Security Council, but I can say this, we discussed it a lot during the high-level advisory board, of course, and we were first advised not to do so because nothing will happen anyway. Doesn't matter what you propose, nothing will happen, but we said we can't avoid that because it's so at the center of the discussion. We cannot say nothing about the Security Council because then probably no one will read our report thinking that we don't understand anything. So we said something, but we didn't come up with any solutions on exactly. We said we have to take more into considerations, of course, population in different parts of the world, different parts of the regions, and we didn't write it, but in my view, for example, the African continent is, I think, the only continent that will grow substantially in terms of population in the next decades, whereas almost all the others will shrink or stand still. So that's a given one. I know that India, of course, given its population. So we didn't write countries, but we said, hello, if you want to become more legitimate, the representation must be much more fair. We also said, and then we ducked the issue of veto because given more countries veto rights, is that really helping, or is it making things more complicated? And if you have new permanent members without veto rights, you would have 3 different degrees of members. You would have permanent with veto, permanent without veto, and non-permanent. So that's also a problem. But what we said was, if the Security Council is not able to handle a situation, the matter should go faster to the General Assembly. So it doesn't stop, because when everything stops in the process, well, the conflict is still ongoing and is building up, so we have to find other ways. And we think that the United Nations can work more with regions, regional organizations, and so we find new tools to handle those kind of situations. When it comes to...
Stefan, maybe just, this is the last comment before we...
The power balance, okay, we'll let me see now. The power balance, and I think this is perhaps one of the most crucial issues. We must get away from this win-lose thinking, that if someone else gains something, if someone else can develop in a good way, I lose. It's the other way around. We have to start looking at things at win-win. So if poorer countries, other countries are doing well, it doesn't have to be that I'm doing worse. It could be actually the other way around. So I think we need to think a bit. Absolutely last, the SDG, yes, you're right. There is an SDG summit this year that is very, very important, not least to developing countries. So we have to show on this year's SDG summit that we are serious, and start by making sure that we can deliver on this 100 billion promise that we made 2009, and we haven't delivered yet, which is a shame. And so if we want to get into a dialogue, start showing that we are serious.
I mean, I think the dilemma which you raise about how do you use a damaged architecture to fix a damaged architecture? Right? It's working within a damaged system which is constraining one's actions the whole time to try to make things better. This is the set of issues, the set of challenges which we're looking at. And I think it's really interesting and important that you raise trust and mistrust as the issue, because that's the lubricant for cooperation, especially if there is something wrong with the institutional architecture. So I think, yeah, we're moving along some interesting themes here. Rada, over to you and the crisis that you wanted to focus on.
Well, so this is not my favorite crisis, but it certainly is a crisis that has been uppermost in my mind for a little while now, and that is the crisis of democracies in South Asia and parts of East Asia. As perhaps you're aware, a lot of democracies in South Asia have ceased to be so. Pakistan is a clear example of a country which had maybe you would like to call it a hybrid democracy, but nevertheless, it had strong elements of democracy, and now each one of those is under threat. It's a situation of anarchy now. India itself has moved rightwards away from the more liberal aspects of its democracy to a more autocratic system in which perhaps the only thing left is some element of electoral democracy. The rest has gone. Civil liberties, human rights, etc., have more or less been obliterated. Next to us, the worst crisis, of course, is in Myanmar, which is partly South Asia and partly Southeast Asia. And there you see that you had a fragile beginning, finally, of democracy based on a compromise, and that's gone. You have the military return, and most tragically for me, in this attack on democracy by the military in Myanmar, for the first time, actually, I've seen the pro-democracy forces getting more democratic. You have truly now a federal approach. The ethnic groups that were quite marginalized earlier by a degree of Burmese domination have now had to pick up the slack because most of the leading Democrats are in prison. So it's the ethnic groups that have come together. They have formed a federal charter. I mean, to me, this was actually an inspiration to see how, when you have to resist attacks on your democracy, you further democratize. It's quite a remarkable thing when you are being bombed, when your children are being killed, that you can still have the will and the passion to continue your attempts at least to democratize within your own groups where you have some options available to you. But having said that, what does distress me greatly is to see how little we in our region have responded to these crises. We are not helping each other to shore up our democracies when we have them. This comes to your prevention point. You know, it's sad to say democracies in our region have been quite fragile right from the beginning. And we had the time, we had the opportunity to help each other, to build our institutions, to give them firm roots. And, you know, we tend to imagine that democracies are within national boundaries. But actually, the strength or the resilience of a democracy often lies in the extent to which it is helped by its neighbors and shared across borders with its neighbors, not to mention internationally as well. And what I have seen is that maybe because Ukraine is so major an issue, very little attention is being paid to the kinds of democratic crises that we are undergoing in South Asia. And you know, one of the questions that has persistently raised itself in my mind is twofold. Our own regional cooperation organization, the South Asian Association for Regional Cooperation, was more or less put on a back burner, partly due to India-Pakistan conflicts and also due to a frustration amongst Indian policymakers that we were just not able to make this go ahead even on issues like trade or cooperation on health. And education and what we call poverty reduction. But ASEAN looked like, a little bit like the African Union, it looked like a success story. It certainly was a success when it came to trade. But when it has come to security or peace and peace building, it has proved to be quite a failure. So one question that arises in that context is what level of multilateral and international support does a regional organization need in order to be able to be effective in preventing conflict, or at least dealing with the crisis in whichever way is possible at that point in time. The second is that we have also not done very well in building civil society networks across our region. And this is interesting because we actually all know each other very well. Over the past 40, 50 years, civil society groups in Pakistan, Bangladesh, Nepal, India, even Myanmar, have networked, have worked together on thematic causes, and yet when you have governments that prefer to marginalize civil society, it seems to be relatively easy for them to be able to do that. We don't seem to be able for our networks to come together to support each other. I mean, I still feel sore that women's groups in America are more active on education for women in Afghanistan than our women's groups are in South Asia. This seems to me to be a terrible inversion of the way things should happen. And we need to think very seriously about what we can do about those two things. Last point I wanted to make very quickly is that, again, if democracies are moving in an autocratic direction, it's often taking signals from each other. Now the question is that if India, being the largest country in South Asia with borders to all the neighboring countries in South Asia, so if India is, in my opinion, India is beginning to move back towards democracy, and if that is happening, could it have a ricochet effect in the region? And on your sanctions point, I campaigned quite hard for targeted sanctions. And I'm really happy that that happened, and I think targeted sanctions are effective. And the more they are applied, the more effective they will be.
So, I mean, at the end, before you made the sanctions point, you were pointing out that the crisis of democracy is much wider than South and Southeast Asia. And I mean, I think it's true that all the monitors of democratic quality around the world are all seeing a decline. So, Mohammed, what are your thoughts on what Radha was saying?
Well, based on what you just said, I was in Kenya 2 weeks ago in Nairobi at the Mo Ibrahim weekend. And the Mo Ibrahim Index has become one of the standards, certainly, for measuring democracies in Africa. And the most recent report has a point that even some of the stronger or more performing democracies in Africa have slipped or are slipping in their rankings. And of course, you'll know also that one of the growing concerns on the continent is about unconstitutional changes of government, where, for instance, West Africa, where we thought we had put coup d'etats behind us, we've had 5 coup d'etats, 2 each in Burkina Faso and in Mali, in addition to the coup d'etat in Guinea and a number of failed attempts. So it becomes worrying. But as you said, I mean, particularly in Africa, I think instrumentalization of power via courts and police, to target opponents, to persecute opponents, restriction of public space for civil society and others. Of course, use of personal power, state capture for family and friends. These have offered opportunist military an entry into the political arena again, regrettably, sometimes with popular support. And you're wondering, why are people jeering? Are they aware of the consequences? Or do they think this will be short-lived? And so these are legitimate concerns. The general retreat in democracy. And then on the continent, many civil society and analysts are also attributing some of that to maybe a slippage even in advanced democracies, without naming names. That elections have been contested in countries where it would have been taboo, etc. So these are all factors at play here. And the challenge is for democracy advocates to be more vigilant, civil society to organize, and to hold back this retreat so that we can reverse it in a positive direction.
Time is beginning to press down upon us, so we need to crack on a bit, so crisp as possible.
Crisp as possible. So I was just thinking about Joni Mitchell's we don't know what we've got till it's gone, right? Which I think is where you were going. And how do we value our democracies today? And it seems to me there are two ways in which we're making mistakes. One is that we take them for granted. And perhaps part of that, but it's another side of the coin, is that we literally devalue them because we keep saying they're not good enough. And then we don't realize it until they've gone. So that's all I wanted to say. Was that crisp?
Crisp.
I just want to pick up on the civil society perspective, because I think that's crucial. And first time I visited Ukraine as Prime Minister, I saw that with Ukraine is something, as I see it, at least similar to our civil society, because it is strong. I think ours has become perhaps weaker as well. But the civil society is really about building trust.
Yeah.
Again, that's trust in the society.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I remember telling my wife when we watched these horrible scenes from the war in Ukraine, but also hear about the courage and the strength that the Ukrainians are showing. I said, I think part of it has to do with a strong civil society. I'm convinced of that, and I think
sure you're right.
so. I think for us to support a strong civil society is very important in democracy.
We do have space for a question or two from the audience, but again, with the condition being crispness. One right beside you.
My name is Sarah, and I work for Crises, a civil society organization in Sweden. We work with peace projects both in Sweden and internationally. And I love that last point. And actually, I'm wondering, that Stefan made just now, I'm wondering how can the more high-level parts of security and international architecture for peace support civil society efforts, because this idea of trust, it's really like the craftsmanship of civil society. That's where those are the actors that are best at building trust. How can we draw learning from that when it comes to the more high-level talks and processes?
Hi, good afternoon. My name is Malin Brenk. I'm from Kvinna till Kvinna Foundation. I'm going to be crisp and just say that I've been in this field for about 20 years, and we've been talking prevention for about 20 years. And I feel that we're not really getting to the how. And those of you who've been around as long as I have remember responsibility to protect. I know that concept is dead, but is there anything there that we can salvage? Is there anything we can pick up? Because it was a genuinely good idea, wasn't it? So my question is maybe to the whole group, what can we do if we do have a multilateral system that can't fix itself because it's not functioning? Could there be aspects of responsibility to protect that could be at the regional level? Could we find another way to use the ideas that come?
Okay, thank you, Malin. And Kevin at the back. Democratically and crisply.
Thank you so much. Question for Dr. Kumar. Idea, which is the national body that of which India is a member state, and it so happens that I was in India just last week. And my question to you is that, I have the we are one of those bodies that measures. I have the nagging impression that we measure and monitor the performance of democracy. We tend to focus too much on the national level. Mm-hmm. And in a country like India, as in Nigeria, big, complex places with a very strong subnational. Mm-hmm. So my question to you is the subnational level of politics in India as chaotic, as boisterous, as democratic as it has always been? And therefore, the seeds for a turnaround in India might be there.
Great, Kevin, thanks. But rather, again, the pressure is on just 1 minute of response. So
okay.
Pick one thing really.
Okay. Well, thank you for that comment. And actually, I do believe our turnaround
Go ahead,
to
leave it.
democracy is coming from the state level, not from the national level, but the individual states. So absolutely, that's the foundation. And by the way, I've used international idea as assessments in my new book. So
that was a crisp plug.
Yeah.
Very good.
You know, this is not connected directly to what you've said, but indirectly it is. I remember that the EU would always say to many of us in India that, oh, we hold you to a higher standard than many other countries because you are a democracy. And I would say there's the beginning of the problem. You should, rather than saying hold you to a higher standard, you should be saying, well, what can we do to help you strengthen your democracy? That would at least be a positive way through. Mm-hmm. I couldn't agree more with everything else that you've said. On R2P...
Radha, I'm really sorry.
Okay.
We won't have time to hear Mohammed's thoughts, and the clock is ticking on, I can see it.
Later.
Mm-hmm. So, Mohammed, over to you for the crisis that you wanted to focus on.
I will pick Sudan, because Sudan really depresses me. I spent time there leading the UN mission in Sudan, in El Fasher, in Darfur, and a lot was invested trying to help resolve that crisis and the general crisis in Sudan as a whole. But as we see, it has sharply deteriorated recently. As a matter of fact, I was nominated High Representative for Silencing the Guns in Africa in late January, and so we got a lot of congratulations, and then boom, Sudan, Khartoum fighting, and then I got a lot of commiserations, and it's understandable. The fighting in Khartoum itself, couldn't be more horrendous. Actually, these days of instant information, we actually see fighter jets dropping bombs in the city. And of course, on the other hand, the rapid support forces, in a very rowdy manner, shooting in heavily built, populated areas. This is really unacceptable. And I think that is why it is very worrying. Already, if you look at the numbers of this place, the humanitarian crisis generated at the moment when humanitarian workers are struggling to get funding for most of the situations around the world. But the other side, which we don't see much because of the focus on Khartoum this time, is that it's escalated in the periphery areas, certainly in Darfur and in the west of Sudan, particularly in West Darfur, around Al Geneina. And recent outbreak of fighting a week ago, there were 300 deaths in a matter of a day or two. So it's that scale of killing and destruction, which is very worrying. But then also, it is obvious, clearly undermining the transition to democracy, which was on course. That transition was sufficiently challenged. But now with the outbreak of this fighting between the two generals, it has further undermined the efforts to broaden governance, to bring on board the society and political parties and other organized groups, because the military is once again in Sudan asserting itself, one general against the other. And then also the repercussions in the sub-region. It's a fragile sub-region with many fragile states. South Sudan, Chad, Central Africa Republic, name it. Ethiopia, which is so these are all countries with their own challenges of peace and security. And with Sudan being so large and having all these neighbors, we have already seen an outflow of civilian population, refugees in all these countries, internally displaced in huge numbers. So I think we should welcome the efforts that have been made by different actors, but especially the Saudi, US-led ceasefire, which was signed yesterday. We hope the ink will be allowed to dry before there are violations, as this will be the 7th ceasefire, and so this is becoming unacceptable. Let's hope that ceasefire holds. But beyond that, the discussions need to be broadened beyond the military to bring in the forces of change, political parties, and other actors, and neighboring, important, significant neighboring countries, like Egypt, like Djibouti, which has been playing a mediation role, and because it is a seat of IGAD, which has taken the lead in this, Kenya, Uganda. The AU needs to also be involved in this, working closely, of course, with Arab League. I think these are some of the efforts that we need to see undertaking. Of course, the partners will then be in a position to support whatever agreements are concluded. But I think the time is now to put maximum pressure on the military leaders as SAF and the RSP.
Thank you, Mohammed. Patricia, you comment?
Well, I was thinking about just coming back to where we were at the beginning, and that's the complexity issue and this interconnectedness that we're seeing. And here we have a situation where you've talked about, you know, the interconnectedness of all the countries around it, and particularly then when we get migration, and there are already so many stresses on those countries due to other crises that we've mentioned, such as climate change, such as food insecurity, such as, you know, the political difficulties within those countries. So it's every single event like this creates an impact through a networked a network of already stressed pathways that then creates it more difficult. So it's brought us right back to the beginning, I think. Thank you, Mohammed.
Stefan?
Perhaps rather a question back to Mohammed. We can discuss this later, but I mean, you know this conflict so much better. But since, I mean, one of the root causes of this is that there were two power centers built up during the former administration, and in order to learn more, to what lessons are learned, those are also things that we have to observate and be aware of. Once you start the democratic transitions, what are the obstacles, the threats that we are built in to this society, and another, can the region also in this case play a bigger role?
Radha?
I don't really have a question, but one thing that strikes me about Sudan is that comprehensive peace agreement, well, it was the longest peace agreement I've ever read. But apart from that, the armed groups actually did agree to DDR to a large extent. So it's the official armed groups that have undermined the whole peace, not the unofficial, which is, you know, the norm.
And again, open to the audience for any crisp comments or questions.
Crisp.
Please.
Crisp is the word.
Yes.
Thank you. Olena Nikolenko, visiting researcher at Uppsala University. I have a question that kind of
maybe it builds upon what have been said earlier about other crises. I think one of the things that I've noticed is that autocracies, autocrats appear to assume a more prominent role in trying to pose as peace settlers. I mean, in the case of Sudan, you mentioned Saudi Arabia, yeah, that played a role in trying to negotiate a peace agreement. In the case of the war in Ukraine, China tried to pose as or float some idea of a peace treaty, peace agreement, or Turkey also. So what are the implications of autocracies acting as
autocracies as peacemakers?
As peacemakers, yeah. What are the implications of it for global order and democratic development? Because certainly, you know, in the case of China, it has a vested interest and ties to the aggressor state. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Mohammed, for a few more thoughts?
Yes, just to say that in the situation that we find ourselves with Sudan and with the influence that Saudi Arabia has over the two generals, a role is there for them to play, at least to achieve a ceasefire in the first instance. Both generals are known to have supported the efforts of Saudi in Yemen, you know, and sent troops there. I mean, both the SAF, but also the RSP. You know, so they have participated in the war in Yemen. But now that that is coming down, the Saudis can lean on them to get them to not only sign the ceasefire, but hold them to ensure that the ceasefire holds and that the fighting stops in Khartoum. Beyond that, I would advocate a broadening, and that's why I'm saying that regional leaders, the AU, working with IGAD and regional leaders, should be involved in ensuring a truly comprehensive national conference. I think Sudan needs that, because this is probably a moment for Sudan to pose itself some very fundamental questions which in the past perhaps they haven't really addressed. Because let's not forget that the past 50 years, there was 17 years of Numeri, followed by 30 years of Bashir, and now this transition of 3 years under the generals. So the Sudanese population as such have never really had an opportunity to question what kind of state do we want to build, and what kind of government do we want to establish, what institutions, what are the protections that the people will be guaranteed, what would be the nature, how about social cohesion, how are we going to build it? These are fundamental questions that need to be addressed, and that, I think, was beginning to happen at the beginning of the transition. But very quickly, this was nipped in the bud when the military dismissed Hamdoun and the civilian-led government and asserted itself again. And in that conversation, the Sudan military will have to be part of it for them to understand exactly what the nature and role of a military in a democratic dispensation will be. I mean, one cannot ignore such a powerful force in a country like Sudan. But they have to understand also that in a democratic dispensation, there are limits. And there has to be a fundamental acceptance of civilian control over the military. Some people will say security sector reform is needed with all that it implies. That's true. But I think that the opportunity is presented now for a very, in West Africa we call it Sovereign National Council. that bring as broad a spectrum as a population as possible, has happened in a number of countries that were transitioning from military rule, they call it long periods, 30 years, etc. But ultimately, involving the military, all said that now, let's discuss the nature of the state, the democratic state, we shall all commit to build. I think an opportunity is presented now to do that in Sudan.
And if you think about it, I mean, in Latin America, there was a time when you looked at the map and you just saw a military cap on the head of every head of government, head of state. And then there was a time when you looked and it looked different. So the transition is complicated. And in part, it's complicated precisely because you have to have, whether it's the autocrat or it's the military, you have to have a force involved there with which many people would prefer not to shake hands. Well, but hands need to be shaken in order to get the opportunity then to build a proper peace. So in the relation to Sudan, it may be indeed that Saudi Arabia now plays a key role, but the African Union needs to know when is the time for it to be stepping in with more. And I think that this is in some ways emblematic of the problems that we've been talking about this evening. I mean, we began, as Patricia reminded us just now, with complexity, and we understood the importance in a sense of, a healthy society. If you want high levels of public health, you have to live in healthy ways. And the world has not been. I think if there's a lesson which comes out of this, because time is always our enemy in discussions like this, and I hope despite the emphasis on crispness, you have found it interesting and you have found insights. And I'm going to give you my one takeaway now, which I think is in 5 words, building on the Joni Mitchell theme of you don't know what you've got till it's gone. Don't take stuff for granted. Don't take it for granted. Don't take nature for granted. Don't take freedom of speech for granted. Don't take peace for granted. Democracy, human rights. These things get built, and then they get defended, or they slip away. And we're seeing now a period where too many of them are slipping away. And the energy needs to be put back together, and I think that the theme of trust and cooperation, which you brought up, Stefan, is an important part of that. So maybe it's work together in order not to take stuff for granted. I'll leave you with that thought, and thank you very much for attending and participating, and thank you to the panel.